The rain didn't just fall on Blackwood Mountain Penitentiary, it clawed at the stone, a frantic, percussive assault that matched the turmoil brewing within its walls. From the panoramic window of her third-floor office, Warden Evelyn Reed watched the storm. She was a woman carved from granite and resolve, a black woman who had climbed to the peak of this brutal, male-dominated world, and her stillness was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The wind howled through the Appalachian hollows, rattling the very bones of the century-old prison. But inside Evelyn's sanctuary of order, the only sound was the quiet hum of a computer. Then, it happened. A section of the prison yard lights flickered and died, plunging the D-block corridor into an inky, impenetrable blackness. Evelyn didn't flinch. Her dark eyes, which had seen riots quell and hardened men break, registered the outage not with surprise, but with a flicker of something else. Acknowledgement. As if she were a conductor, and this was merely a scheduled silence in her symphony of control. A beat of silence hung in the air, heavy and expectant. Then the shriek of the D-block emergency alarm tore through the night, a raw, mechanical scream of violation. It had all started with a different kind of storm 3 months earlier, a quiet one that arrived in a slate-gray armored transport on a deceptively sunny morning. That was the day Caleb Cal Thorne came to Blackwood. His file painted a simple picture: white-collar criminal, a Wall Street wunderkind convicted of a multi-million-dollar securities fraud. But the man who stepped out of the van was no simple picture. He was tall, with an easy athletic grace that the shackles and orange jumpsuit couldn't conceal. His hair was the color of dark honey, and his eyes, a startling shade of blue, held an unnerving intelligence. Evelyn met him in the sterile intake room, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and despair. Blackwood was her kingdom, a brutal fiefdom she ruled with an unyielding grip. It was a place where old hatreds festered, a relic of a system built by and for white men. And she, Dr. Evelyn Reed, was its unlikely queen. She had fought for every inch of her authority, and she wore it like armor. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice a low, modulated instrument of command. "Welcome to Blackwood. Here, we have rules. You will find that life is much simpler when you follow them." Cal met her gaze directly. There was no fear in his eyes, no deference, only a disarming curiosity. He smiled, a slow, confident curve of his lips. "Dr. Reed," he replied, his voice a smooth baritone that seemed out of place in this concrete box. He tilted his head, his gaze sweeping over her impeccably tailored suit, the severe lines of her hair, the fortress of her desk. "I've read about this place. A place this harsh needs an even harsher woman to rule it." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Must be lonely at the top." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, not because they were an insult, but because they were the truth. In her 25 years in the system, men had feared her, resented her, challenged her. None had ever dared to name her isolation. It was a violation of an unspoken rule, a sudden, intimate glimpse into the very core of her being. She felt a crack appear in the placid granite facade she presented to the world. "Your station in life here, Mr. Thorne, will be determined by your actions, not your observations," she said, her voice colder than before, a desperate attempt to shore up her defenses. He merely nodded, the ghost of that smile still on his lips. "Of course, Warden." As the guards led him away, Evelyn remained standing behind her desk, the echo of his words reverberating in the silence. He was dangerous, not because of the crime he'd committed. Financial ruin was a clean, abstract violence compared to the blood and bone brutality of her usual clientele. He was dangerous because, in a single sentence, he had seen her. He had bypassed the warden and spoken directly to the woman, and that was a threat more potent than any shiv carved from a toothbrush. She had spent a lifetime building a fortress of order around a heart full of carefully managed loneliness, and Caleb Thorne felt like a hairline fracture in its foundation. The alarm was still screaming from D-block, a sound from the future, a prophecy of the chaos this one man would unleash. Cal's seduction of Evelyn was a masterpiece of patient, intellectual predation. He didn't use flattery or crude charm. He used her own mind as his weapon. Assigned to the prison library, a privilege Evelyn herself granted, a small test she now recognized as her first mistake, he began to transform it. He didn't just shelve books, he curated them. He rearranged the philosophy section, creating a silent dialogue between Kant and Nietzsche on one shelf. Marcus Aurelius and Seneca on another. He began leaving notes for her, not love letters, but something far more insidious. Tucked into a volume of James Baldwin, a single underlined passage about the weight of navigating a white world. Inside a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, a sticky note with a single handwritten question. Does power ever cease to be a burden? They were breadcrumbs leading her down a path of intellectual intimacy, a space where she could shed the heavy mantle of Warden and simply be a mind in conversation with another. Their talks started tentatively across the wide expanse of the library checkout desk. They spoke of literature, of history, of the flawed nature of justice. Cal never once mentioned her race directly, but he spoke around it, acknowledging the unique pressures she faced with a startling empathy. "They don't ever really respect you, do they?" he said one evening, his voice a low murmur as he repaired the spine of an old book. "They only fear you. They see a black woman in a position of ultimate authority, and they're just waiting for you to fail. Every success is just a temporary reprieve." He was articulating the deepest, most private wound of her professional life, the constant grinding pressure to be twice as good, twice as tough, just to be considered equal. The silent condescension from the old guard, the ones who saw her position as an anomaly, a political concession rather than a meritocracy. He was giving voice to the dragon she fought alone in the dark every night. The abstract became brutally concrete one Tuesday evening. O'Malley, a veteran corrections officer with a belly full of beer and resentment, sauntered into the library. He was a relic of the old Blackwood, a man who believed the world had been turned upside pivoted since Evelyn's appointment. "Hey girl," he called out, his voice dripping with a casual, dismissive racism that was meant to sting. "Lockups in 15. Better get your boy here back to his cage." The air went ice cold. Cal froze, his hands hovering over a stack of books, his eyes fixed on Evelyn. The entire prison ran on a delicate balance of perceived power, and O'Malley had just thrown a grenade into the heart of it. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto O'Malley with the intensity of a laser. "Officer O'Malley," she said, each word a perfectly formed shard of ice. "Place your badge and your sidearm on this desk. Your employment at Blackwood Mountain Penitentiary is terminated, effective immediately. You will be escorted from the premises." O'Malley's jaw dropped. He sputtered, turning red, but one look at the absolute finality in her eyes, and he knew it was over. He slammed his badge on the counter and stormed out, cursing under his breath. Silence descended. Evelyn stood there, her chest tight, the familiar bitter taste of righteous fury in her mouth. She had won, but the victory felt hollow, another battle in a war that would never end. She finally looked at Cal. He hadn't moved. He wasn't looking at her with pity or shock. He was looking at her with a profound, terrifying understanding. His eyes said it all. "See, this is what you deal with. This is the world you live in. Only I understand." He had taken her righteous anger, her lifelong struggle, and turned it into a foundation for their connection. He was no longer just an inmate. He was her confidant, her secret ally in a hostile world. He had seen the ugliness she faced and hadn't flinched. Instead, he had used it to draw the circle of their intimacy tighter, isolating her from everyone else until he was the only one left inside. She felt a dangerous warmth spread through her, a gratitude that was tangled inextricably with dread. She was the warden, the ultimate authority, but in that moment, she felt like a prisoner, and he, the inmate, was the one holding the key. The line between intellectual intimacy and physical transgression is a fragile one, and in the claustrophobic world of Blackwood, it shattered with breathtaking speed. The affair didn't begin in a shadowed cell or a hidden corner of the yard. It began in the one place that was most sacrosanct, the most audacious symbol of her power, her own office. It was a late Thursday night. The prison was quiet, settled into the deep, watchful slumber of lockdown. Evelyn was working late, a common occurrence, but her focus wasn't on the budget reports in front of her. It was on the man who had been summoned to her office under the pretense of discussing a new library literacy program. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, a current of energy so potent it was almost visible. Cal stood by the window, looking out at the distant, indifferent lights of a town miles away. "You know," he said, not turning around, "the most secure prison isn't the one with the highest walls. It's the one where everyone is so busy watching each other, they forget to watch the person in charge. He turned then and crossed the room in 3 silent strides. He stopped in front of her desk, close enough for her to smell the clean, institutional scent of his clothes mixed with something that was uniquely him, the faint aroma of old paper and ink. "No one is watching you, Evelyn." Her name on his lips, spoken in a whisper in the heart of her fortress, was an act of supreme rebellion. He leaned across the desk, and she didn't move back. She couldn't. Her breath caught in her throat as he kissed her. It wasn't a soft, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of conquest, a claiming of forbidden territory. It was reckless, insane, and it felt like the first honest thing to happen to her in years. Their tryst became a dangerous game, a tightrope walk over a chasm of ruin. They found moments in empty classrooms after dark, in the dusty archives room, always under the shadow of discovery. This constant humming thread of exposure didn't deter them. It fueled them, sharpening their senses, making every stolen touch, every whispered word, more potent. And they were not entirely unseen. Deputy Warden Dakota Ramsey, a young woman whose career Evelyn had personally saved from an abuse of power allegation years ago, was the first to notice. She saw the pattern, the late-night summons, the lingering looks in the hallway. Then, one night, while doing a late security check, she saw it. Through the slightly ajar door of a disused records room, she saw the warden pressed against a filing cabinet, Cal's hands tangled in her hair. Dakota froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her duty was clear: report it immediately. But what she felt was not outrage. It was a cold, creeping fear, mingled with a powerful, misguided sense of loyalty. To expose Evelyn would be to destroy the one person who had ever believed in her. But to stay silent was to become an accomplice. She backed away silently, her face burning with the secret. She was trapped. From that day on, her complicity grew. A glitch in the security feed for the administration wing. A sudden, urgent need for her to handle a dispute in a far-off block, leaving the 3rd floor unpatrolled for a crucial 30 minutes. She never spoke of it to Evelyn, and Evelyn never acknowledged it. But a new understanding passed between them in their daily briefings, a silent, transactional gratitude that felt more like a threat. One afternoon, Evelyn found Dakota staring at a live feed of the library on her monitor. Cal was visible, shelving books. "Is there a problem, Deputy Warden?" Evelyn asked, her voice neutral. Dakota quickly switched the screen. "No, Warden, just ensuring all protocols are being followed." Evelyn placed a hand on Dakota's shoulder, a gesture that was both maternal and menacing. "Loyalty is the most valuable currency in a place like this, Dakota. Never forget that." It was a confirmation and a command, a thank you and a warning. Dakota was no longer just an observer. She was a participant, bound to the secret by a chain of gratitude and fear. The affair was no longer just a secret between 2 people. It was a conspiracy, and its roots were beginning to spread, poisoning everything they touched. Dakota felt the weight of it settle on her, the cold, heavy burden of a silence that she knew, with a terrible certainty, would eventually be paid for in blood. Evelyn Reed began to live a life cleaved in 2. By day, she was the warden of Blackwood, an avatar of discipline. She walked the tiers with an unapproachable aura, her presence alone enough to silence the raucous din of the cell blocks. Her voice, crisp and devoid of emotion, cut through the tension of a yard dispute between rival gangs. Her authority an invisible, unassailable wall. She was in complete control, a master of her domain, the living embodiment of the order she worshipped. But when night fell and the prison sank into its restless sleep, another Evelyn emerged. In the stolen moments with Cal, the armor dissolved. She became a woman she barely recognized, a creature of want and vulnerability. The rigid lines of her face would soften. The guarded look in her eyes would melt away, replaced by a warmth that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. He would read to her from Keats and Neruda, his voice a low, hypnotic rumble in the quiet of her office, and she would feel the decades of loneliness and self-denial begin to recede. This duality was a dangerous intoxicant. The stark contrast between her 2 lives made the moments with Cal feel more real, more vital. She was playing with fire, and she knew it. But the cold emptiness of her life without him seemed a far greater risk. One rainy evening, they were huddled in the library's small, windowless archive room, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten inmates filed away in cardboard boxes. The rhythm of the rain against the roof was a soothing drumbeat, creating a fragile bubble of peace in the heart of the violent institution. Cal was tracing the lines on her palm, his touch gentle, reverent. Suddenly, he was seized by a coughing fit. It wasn't a simple clearing of the throat. It was a deep, racking cough that shook his entire body. It was a dry, brutal sound that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his lungs. He quickly turned away from her, pressing a fist to his mouth, his shoulders heaving. "Cal, are you all right?" Evelyn asked, a sliver of clinical concern piercing through the romantic haze. "Fine," he rasped, his voice strained. "Just a cold. This old place is full of drafts." He turned back to her, forcing a smile, but his face was pale, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead. As he lowered his hand, Evelyn caught a fleeting glimpse of it, a split-second image that would burn itself into her memory. On the cuff of his orange jumpsuit, almost hidden in the fabric's fold, was a tiny dark smear, a smudge of crimson. Blood. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every instinct she possessed, every lesson learned from a lifetime of vigilance, screamed at her. This was wrong. This was a symptom, a warning sign. But the woman who was in love with him, the woman who needed him, pushed the warden aside. She chose to believe the lie. "You should see Dr. Frost," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I'm fine, Evelyn. Really," he insisted, pulling her closer, his lips finding hers, a desperate, almost frantic kiss that was meant to distract, to erase the moment. And she let it. She allowed herself to be swept back into the illusion, to sink into the warmth of his embrace and ignore the cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She chose ignorance. She chose the beautiful, fragile lie over the ugly, terrifying truth that had just coughed itself into existence between them. It was a conscious decision, a willful act of blindness. In that moment of denial, Evelyn Reed, the woman who saw everything, chose not to see the one thing that mattered. She had silenced the alarm bell in her own soul, and in doing so, she had sealed her fate. The betrayal had already begun, not with his deception, but with her own. The summons from Dr. Frost's office came on a sterile, sun-bleached Monday morning. It was a routine part of senior staff protocol, annual physicals, blood work, mundane, but the look on Dr. Frost's face when Evelyn walked in was anything but. Dr. Frost was a woman as pragmatic and unyielding as Evelyn herself, a military veteran who treated medicine as a science of absolutes. There was no room for bedside manner in her world, only diagnoses. She didn't ask Evelyn to sit. She simply slid a single sheet of paper across her metal desk. "We need to talk, Evelyn." Evelyn's eyes scanned the page, a blur of medical jargon and acronyms. Then, 2 words leaped out, stark and brutal against the clinical white background. HIV positive. The room went silent. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing in on her. It was a mistake. It had to be. Her life was a closed loop of work and solitude. It was impossible. Her mind, a precision instrument trained to find logical patterns, frantically searched for an explanation and found only one. A coughing fit. A smear of blood on an orange sleeve. A lie she had willingly embraced. "This can't be right," she whispered, her voice a stranger's. Dr. Frost's expression was grim, devoid of pity. "We ran the test 3 times. It's definitive." She paused, her gaze unwavering. But that's not the worst of it. She tapped a section of the report detailing viral loads and T-cell counts. "Based on these markers, the infection isn't recent. The virus has been in your system for a while, Evelyn. It's already progressing. We need to start aggressive treatment immediately. And we need a list of any partners. Who did this to you?" The clinical question hit her with the force of a physical assault. "Who did this to you?" The rage came then, not as a hot flash, but as a creeping glacial cold. It froze the shock, the grief, the fear, leaving behind a perfect crystalline certainty. She had been sentenced to death, a slow, creeping cellular execution. She walked out of the infirmary in a daze, the doctor's words echoing in the clinical silence. She didn't go back to her office. She went to the library. Cal was there, sitting at their usual table in the corner, a book open in front of him. He looked up as she approached, a warm, welcoming smile gracing his lips. The smile faltered and died when he saw her face. She didn't have to say a word. He knew. She dropped the medical report on the table between them. "You knew," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. He slowly closed his book, his hands, usually so steady, trembling slightly. He looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "Yes," he breathed. "How long?" "A few years. I found out at my last facility." The confession, so quiet, so simple, was the most violent act she had ever witnessed. It was a confirmation of a betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. "I love you," he whispered, finally looking up, his blue eyes swimming with what he probably thought was remorse. He reached for her hand. "I was going to tell you. I was just so afraid of losing you." Evelyn laughed. It was a terrible sound, sharp and broken, utterly devoid of humor. It was the sound of a soul shattering. "Love?" She pulled her hand back as if his touch were acid. "You don't know the meaning of the word." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper, each word crafted to inflict maximum pain. "You didn't love me. You saw a lonely, powerful woman, and you saw an opportunity. You wanted a softer death, didn't you? A comfortable decline in the arms of the warden, instead of wasting away, alone and forgotten, in a cold cell." She stood up straight, her posture once again regal, her face a mask of cold fury. "You didn't want a lover, Caleb. You wanted a tomb, and you tried to make me yours." She turned and walked away, leaving him sitting there, with the paper that condemned them both. The love she had felt for him, a warm, living thing, had curdled and died in an instant. In its place, something new and terrible was born. It was pure, black, and patient. It was a hate so absolute that it felt like a form of grace. She was no longer a victim of his betrayal. She was the architect of his end. The woman who walked out of the library was not the same one who had walked in. The soft, vulnerable creature Cal had so carefully cultivated was gone, burned away by the white-hot fire of his deceit. In her place stood Warden Reed, but a new, more terrible version. All the discipline, intelligence, and strategic patience that had made her a brilliant administrator were now repurposed for a single, chilling objective: vengeance. Her revenge would not be a crime of passion. It would be a work of art, a masterpiece of institutional violence, executed with the cold, impersonal precision of the system she commanded. The first move was a simple bureaucratic entry. The next morning, she signed the transfer order. Inmate 1138, Caleb Thorne. Reason for transfer: disciplinary infraction, destination, D block. The most dangerous wing in Blackwood, a concrete beast that housed the predators, the unhinged, the lifers with nothing left to lose. It was home to the Aryan Shield, a white supremacist gang that ran the block with brutal efficiency. To send Cal there was not just a transfer, it was a death sentence. But a death sentence required an executioner. That afternoon, she arranged for a random inspection of the solitary confinement unit. There, in a bare cell, sat the man they called Preacher. He was the undisputed leader of the Aryan Shield, a gaunt, wiry man with dead eyes and a web of swastika tattoos covering his neck. He was in solitary for nearly killing a guard. Evelyn stood before his cell. The guards kept a respectful distance. She and Preacher just looked at each other through the thick plexiglass of the door. She didn't speak to him. She didn't need to. She turned to Deputy Warden Dakota Ramsey, who stood beside her, pale and trembling, already sensing the precipice they were standing on. Evelyn's voice was calm, almost conversational, but every word was a command. "Dakota," she said, her eyes still locked on Preacher. "I want you to deliver a message for me." Dakota swallowed hard. "Warden?" "Find a way," Evelyn continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Get a message to Preacher. Tell him there's a pest problem in D Block, a new arrival who doesn't respect the established order, a pretty boy snitch who got too close to management." The coded language was clear. In prison hierarchy, no crime was worse. Dakota's face had gone ashen. This was no longer about turning a blind eye to a forbidden affair. This was accessory to murder. "Warden, I can't." Evelyn finally turned her gaze on Dakota, and the sheer cold force of it made the young woman flinch. "You can," Evelyn said, her voice soft but laced with steel. You will. Because loyalty is a two-way street, isn't it? I saved your career. I trusted you. Now, I need you. She paused, letting the unspoken threat hang in the air. Tell him the reward for his janitorial services will be a 30-minute system-wide camera malfunction in D Block next week. A blind spot. A gift. She had laid the trap. She had baited it. And she had forced the hand of her most loyal subordinate, making her an unwilling co-conspirator. It was a move of breathtaking cruelty. She was using the very racist filth she had spent her career fighting, turning their vile ideology into her personal instrument of retribution. It was a monstrous perversion of justice, a deal made not with the devil, but with the demons she kept locked in her own prison. As she walked away from the solitary wing, the sterile hallway felt colder than usual. She felt no guilt, no remorse. The love was dead. The woman who had loved was dead. All that remained was a cold, calculating engine of hate. She had become the abyss she had spent her life staring into, and she was about to drag Caleb Thorne down into it with her. Dakota, her face a mask of horror, watched her go, knowing she had just become the hand that would pass the sentence. For Caleb Thorne, D Block was not just a change of scenery. It was a descent into a living, breathing hell. The general population had been a dangerous but navigable ecosystem. D Block was a shark tank, and he had been thrown in bleeding. The news of his affair with the Warden, twisted and exaggerated, had preceded him. He wasn't just another inmate. He was a symbol of ultimate transgression, the man who had slept with the enemy. The torture was systematic, a slow, grinding erosion of his spirit. It began with small things. His food tray was accidentally knocked to the floor. His soap vanished from the shower. But it quickly escalated. During yard time, he was cornered, his ribs cracked by a silent, brutal beating, while the guards looked the other way. The message was clear. There were no rules for him here. He was property. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was Evelyn's handiwork. This wasn't the chaotic, random violence of prison life. This was organized. This was personal. This was the methodical dismantling of a man, orchestrated by the woman he had fatally misjudged. The irony was a bitter pill. He, the master manipulator, had been outmaneuvered by the one person he thought he had under his control. Desperation began to set in, a cold, clammy fear that was worse than any physical pain. He had to get a message out. He had to tell someone, anyone, the truth. Not to save himself. He knew it was too late for that. But for the record, as a final defiant act, his chance came a week into his ordeal. In a move of exquisite calculated cruelty, Evelyn assigned him to a one-time work detail. Deep cleaning the library archives. Returning him to the scene of their intimacy was her way of twisting the knife. He was escorted by two grim-faced guards, the walk through the quiet, familiar halls of the prison, a ghost tour of his former life. The library was empty, silent. The smell of old paper and binding glue, once a scent of comfort and seduction, now smelled like a morgue. He knew he had only minutes. He frantically searched for a pen, a scrap of paper. He found a small notepad and a golf pencil in a drawer of the checkout desk. His hands shook as he wrote, the words pouring out in a desperate, jagged scrawl. He wrote of their affair, of his diagnosis, of his fear and his stupid, selfish love. He confessed everything, holding nothing back. It was not an excuse, but an explanation. A final plea to be understood as a human being, not just a monster. She has sentenced me to die, he wrote. She is using them to do it. Tell them to look in her eyes. The truth is there. But where to hide it? A book was too obvious. She would expect that. She would have the entire library searched. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the corner where they had spent so many hours. There, sitting in the shadows, was a worn, dark leather armchair. Its upholstery was cracked, its stuffing peeking through a tear in the armrest. It was their chair. He acted quickly. He tore the letter into several small, folded pieces. With trembling fingers, he pushed them deep into the gash in the armchair's side, forcing them down, past the yellowed foam, into the dusty, dark cavity of the frame. It was a long shot, a message in a bottle thrown into a vast, indifferent ocean. But it was all he had left. It was a final, desperate echo, hidden in the heart of their shared memory. a testament he hoped would one day be found. As the guards led him back to D Block, he cast one last look at the library. The armchair sat in the corner, a silent, unassuming witness. He had planted the seed of the truth. He could only pray that, long after he was gone, it would find a way to grow in the darkness. The night of the execution arrived with the same storm that had opened the story, as if the heavens themselves were conspiring with Evelyn's rage. Rain lashed against Blackwood's walls, and the wind screamed like a banshee, providing the perfect soundtrack for the horror to come. At 10:17 p.m., as scheduled, a power surge, later attributed to a lightning strike, caused a 30-minute reboot of the security systems in D Block. The cameras went dark. The electronic locks on a secondary maintenance corridor failed to engage. It was the window of opportunity Evelyn had promised. In his cell, Cal heard the telltale click of his lock disengaging. He didn't need to see who was at the door. He knew. The cell door swung open, and Preacher stood there, silhouetted against the dim emergency lights of the hallway. Behind him were two other members of the Aryan Shield, their faces blank, their movements economical and predatory. There was no struggle. Cal knew it was futile. This was not an attack. It was a harvest. They didn't kill him in the hallway. That was too simple, too impersonal. They dragged him through the silent, sleeping prison, their path cleared by a conspiracy of silence and averted eyes. Their destination was the administrative wing on the 3rd floor. They brought him to the one place that represented the absolute peak of power in Blackwood. They brought him to Evelyn's office. The door was unlocked. They shoved him inside. The room was dark save for the cool blue glow of the computer monitor. Cal's eyes adjusted, and he saw the massive oak desk, the neat stacks of files, the framed photo on the corner. It was a picture of a younger Evelyn with a smiling man, her late husband. This was her sanctuary, and they were about to desecrate it. They didn't just kill him. They performed a ritual. They forced him onto his knees before the desk, then slammed his head down onto its polished surface. They bound his hands behind his back with zip ties. They were making him a sacrifice on the altar of her power. Preacher leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and hate. "The warden sends her regards," he whispered. The violence that followed was swift, brutal, and methodical. It was an explosion of pent-up rage, a bloody exorcism. When it was over, the pristine office was a war zone. Blood spattered the walls, the files, the family photograph. Cal's body lay slumped over the desk, his life seeping into the wood grain. But the ritual was not yet complete. Preacher took a book from a small shelf behind the desk. It was one of Evelyn's personal copies. He pried open Cal's cooling fingers and placed the book in his hand, forcing his grip tight around it. The final, symbolic gesture. The warden's signature on her handiwork. The book was Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. They slipped out as silently as they had come, melting back into the shadows of D Block, just as the camera systems flickered back to life. They left behind a scene of unimaginable carnage in the most sacred space in the prison, a tableau of vengeance that was both a brutal murder and a chilling, unambiguous message. The warden had reclaimed her throne, and she had washed it in the blood of the man who had dared to defile it. The Heart of Darkness was no longer just a story on a page. It was beating in the very center of Blackwood Mountain Penitentiary. The crime scene in Warden Reed's office was a paradox. It was an act of extreme frenzied violence that was simultaneously an act of cold, calculated precision. That paradox was not lost on Detective Isabella Rossi. She and her partner, Detective Frank Miller, arrived the next morning. Miller was a man on the cusp of retirement, a veteran of the state police whose worldview was etched in cynical black and white lines. He saw the swastika tattoos on the D Block roster and the victim's file, and his conclusion was immediate. "Gangland trash taking out the pretty boy," he grunted, surveying the bloody office with a weary detachment. "They get territorial. This is an open and shut case. Find the shiv, sweat the skinheads, and we're home for dinner." Rossi wasn't so sure. A young, sharp detective with a reputation for seeing the patterns others missed, she felt a deep, unsettling wrongness about the scene. It was too symbolic. The location, the warden's office, the brutality, it felt personal, not just territorial. And the book, Heart of Darkness, clutched in the victim's hand, that wasn't a gang hit. That was a statement. Their interview with Warden Reed did little to ease Rossi's suspicions. Evelyn received them in a temporary office, a sterile, impersonal room that betrayed none of the horror that had unfolded in her own. She was the picture of professional composure, her voice even, her eyes clear and direct. She recounted the events of the previous night, the storm, the power outage, the discovery of the body, with the detached clarity of a witness, not a victim whose sanctuary had been violated. It's a tragic, but unfortunately not uncommon, event in a facility like this, Evelyn stated, her hands folded neatly on the desk. The tensions in D Block have been high. Mr. Thorne was a disruptive element. Rossi watched her, fascinated. There was no tremor in her voice, no flicker of grief or fear in her eyes. There was only a profound, unnerving calm. When Miller asked about the power outage, she presented a detailed maintenance report from the prison engineer, attributing it to a cascade failure from a lightning strike. It was all perfectly plausible. Too plausible. "Warden," Rossi interjected, her voice soft but firm. "It happened in your office, on your desk. That doesn't feel random to you?" For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Evelyn's face. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, dismissive glint of amusement. "Detective, these men are not rational actors. They are animals. They chose my office to make a statement, to challenge my authority. They failed. My authority is unshaken." Their next interview was with Deputy Warden Dakota Ramsey. If Evelyn was a wall of ice, Dakota was a wall of fog. She was a robot programmed to recite protocol. She answered every question with a clipped, "Yes, detective," or "That is against regulations." Her eyes were wide and haunted, her skin pale, but her testimony was a perfect, impenetrable shield around her superior. She claimed to have been in the central control room for the entire duration of the power outage, coordinating the response, just as the logs showed. The investigation was drowning in a sea of official procedure and unspoken loyalties. The prisoners in D Block, led by Preacher, presented a unified front of absolute silence. They were all in their cells. They saw nothing. They heard nothing. The guards on duty that night had similar stories. They were dealing with the power failure, securing the perimeter. No one saw a thing. It was a perfect conspiracy of silence. Miller grew frustrated, convinced they were being stonewalled by prison politics. But Rossi knew it was more than that. This wasn't just a wall, it was a fortress. And Warden Evelyn Reed was sitting calmly in the throne room, watching them exhaust themselves against its impenetrable ramparts. The truth wasn't just being hidden, it was being actively, brilliantly suffocated. Days turned into a week, and the investigation was stalled, mired in the thick mud of Blackwood's institutional silence. The murder weapon was still missing. The Aryan Shield members had lawyered up, their alibis, that they were locked in their cells during the outage, technically holding. Miller was ready to wrap it up, charge Preacher based on circumstantial evidence, and let the DA sort it out. Rossi couldn't let it go. "It's the room, Frank," she insisted, pacing in their small, temporary office at the prison. "We're missing something about the room, the why." "The why is that they're violent psychos," Miller shot back, tired of the case, tired of the prison's oppressive atmosphere. "No," Rossi said, her eyes alight with a sudden idea. "It's more than that. I want to search the office one more time." "For what? The CSI team tore it apart." "Not for evidence," she said, "for a feeling." She paused, knowing how it would sound. "And I want to bring a dog." Miller rolled his eyes. "A drug dog? A cadaver dog? The body's gone, Rossi." "Neither," she replied, pulling out her phone and making a call. "I'm calling in a specialist." The next day, a state trooper arrived with a Belgian Malinois named Shadow. Shadow wasn't trained to find drugs or bombs. He was a stress odor detection dog, a highly specialized K9 trained to pick up on the unique scent of human cortisol and adrenaline, the smell of extreme fear and stress, which can linger in an environment for days. Miller scoffed, watching from the doorway, as Rossi and the handler led Shadow into the now clean but still unsettling office. The dog sniffed the desk, the floor, the blood-stained section of the wall, with only mild interest. He was about to dismiss the whole thing as New Age nonsense when Shadow's behavior changed. He trotted over to the corner of the room, to a worn, dark leather armchair that had been pushed aside by the crime scene team. Shadow became agitated. He whined, his tail low. and began to scratch insistently at the armrest, his focus absolute. "What's he got?" Rossi asked the handler. "The residual sent here is off the charts," the handler said, amazed. Someone was in a state of extreme terror or desperation right here, much more than anywhere else in the room. Miller was still skeptical. So, the victim was scared. We knew that. But Rossi was staring at the chair, her mind racing. It was out of place. It wasn't part of the desk set. It was an older, more comfortable piece, a reading chair. Her eyes narrowed on the spot where Shadow was scratching, a long, frayed tear in the leather upholstery. On a hunch, she pulled on a pair of latex gloves. "Frank, give me your pocket knife." Ignoring Miller's protests, she carefully widened the tear in the armchair's fabric. She reached deep inside, past the yellowed, crumbling foam stuffing. Her fingers brushed against something. Not fabric, but paper. Small, tightly folded squares of it. She pulled them out, one by one. They were brittle, slightly damp, covered in dust and lint. Carefully, she unfolded them on the clean surface of a filing cabinet. They were pieces of a letter, written in a frantic, spidery hand. She and Miller read it in stunned silence. It was all there. The affair, the HIV diagnosis, the fear, the love, the selfish, desperate plea. "She has sentenced me to die," one piece read. "She is using them to do it." And the final, chilling line, "The truth is in her eyes." They had it. They had the whole, sordid, tragic story. They had the motive. They had the why. They had the voice of the victim, screaming from beyond the grave. But as Rossi looked at the fragmented confession, a cold realization dawned on her. It was a story written by a dead man. It was powerful. It was damning. But it wasn't proof. It was the word of a convicted felon against that of a decorated, powerful warden. They knew, with absolute certainty, that Evelyn Reed had orchestrated a murder, but in the cold, hard calculus of the law, they knew they still couldn't touch her. The truth had been found, but justice remained impossibly out of reach. The case of Caleb Thorne's murder was officially closed. Armed with the letter, the district attorney's office strong-armed Preacher into a plea deal. He confessed to the murder, claiming it was a spontaneous act of gang violence, and accepted an additional life sentence without the possibility of parole. He never once mentioned Warden Reed's name. His silence was absolute, the final payment in his contract. The system had found its scapegoat, and the official narrative was sealed. Warden Evelyn Reed continued her reign at Blackwood Mountain. But something had changed. The respect the staff had for her had curdled into something colder, sharper. Fear. Her authority was no longer just professional. It was primal. She had faced down a challenge to her power in the most brutal way imaginable, and she had won. Her control over the prison was now absolute, her quiet command backed by the unspoken threat of what she was capable of. On the last day of the investigation, Detective Rossi came to Evelyn's office alone. The room had been scrubbed and sanitized, the blood-stained rug replaced, the air filtered, but the ghost of the crime remained. "He left a letter," Rossi said, her voice quiet. "We know what you did." Evelyn looked up from a file, her expression unreadable. She swiveled in her new leather chair, the replacement for the one that had held the secrets. "Detective," she replied, her voice smooth as polished stone. "In our respective lines of work, what we know is often irrelevant. It's what we can prove that matters." She held Rossi's gaze, a silent battle of wills playing out between the two women. "The case is closed." "Justice wasn't served," Rossi stated, a final defiant stand. A small, sad smile touched Evelyn's lips. "Justice," she said, "is not always about the law. Sometimes it's about balance." Months passed. The Appalachian winter thawed into a tentative spring, but the chill inside Blackwood never receded. One night, alone in her office, Evelyn pulled a sealed envelope from her locked desk drawer. It was the result of her latest HIV test, the follow-up she had been avoiding for months. She sat there for a long time, just staring at it. The truth lay inside that thin paper envelope, a truth that would define the rest of her life, however long that might be. Would it be a death sentence, confirming the poison Cal had left in her veins? Or would it be a reprieve, a miracle of science or fate? With a steady hand, she picked up the heavy brass letter opener from her desk, but she didn't open the envelope. Instead, she took out the silver Zippo lighter she kept, a memento from her late husband. She flicked it open, the small flame jumping to life in the dim light. She held the corner of the envelope to the flame. She watched as the fire caught, curling the paper, turning the white to black. The flames consumed the name of the lab, the address, the unknown verdict sealed within. She didn't need to know. She had made her choice months ago in the cold, sterile light of the infirmary. She had chosen power over hope. She had chosen vengeance over life. She watched until the entire envelope was a fragile black ash, which she crushed in a crystal tray on her desk. She had won. She had purged the man who had wronged her. She had secured her kingdom. But as she sat there, alone in the silence, surrounded by the trappings of her absolute power, she was nothing more than a queen reigning over a throne of ash, the ashes of the man she had destroyed, and the ashes of the woman she once had been. Justice, she had told Rosie, was about balance. And in the dark, silent chambers of her own heart, she was beginning to understand the terrible, crushing weight of its price.